when a notorious biker gang decided to terrorize a small roadside cafe in rural Arizona. They had no idea its owner was a decorated Marine Corps veteran. What happened next would become a legend that locals still talk about to this day, a reminder that you never know who you might be messing with. Morrison's Highway Haven Café glowed like a warm oasis against the darkening desert sky, its neon sign casting a gentle blue halo into the gathering dusk. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling burgers wafted through the air, mixing with the sweet scent of apple pie that Rachel Morrison had just pulled from the oven. The evening crowd was the usual mix: long-haul truckers taking their mandated breaks, locals enjoying their nightly rituals, and road-weary travelers seeking refuge from the endless stretch of Highway 87. Rachel moved with military precision between the chrome and red leather booths, her movements efficient yet graceful. Most customers never guessed that before taking over this cafe 3 years ago, she'd served 15 years in the Marine Corps, rising to staff sergeant and leading combat missions in some of the world's most dangerous territories. The only hint of her service was a small Marine Corps flag hanging beside the cafe's entrance and a subtle "Veterans Eat Free on Fridays" sign by the register. At the counter, Elena Torres, Rachel's head waitress and fellow veteran, was sharing a laugh with old Pete, a regular who'd been coming in for the meatloaf special every Tuesday for the past decade. Elena's Army medic training meant she could handle everything from coffee refills to the occasional trucker's dizzy spell with equal composure. Together, she and Rachel had turned Morrison's Highway Haven into more than just a cafe. It was a sanctuary for travelers and veterans alike, a place where the coffee was always hot and the welcome was always warm. The sunset painted the desert landscape in brilliant shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the cafe's parking lot. Through the large windows, Rachel could see heat waves still dancing off the sun-baked asphalt, even as the day's scorching temperatures began to fade. The cafe's ancient air conditioning unit hummed steadily, keeping the interior comfortable despite the Arizona heat. A group of truckers in the corner booth were swapping stories about road conditions and weather patterns, their deep laughs occasionally rising above the gentle clinking of silverware and the soft country music playing from the vintage jukebox. Near the window, a young family was sharing a plate of Rachel's famous chocolate chip pancakes. She never minded serving breakfast for dinner, especially when it put smiles on tired faces. Rachel paused at the counter to refill her coffee cup, her trained eyes automatically scanning the room. Old habits died hard, and 15 years in the Corps had taught her to always maintain situational awareness. She noticed everything: the way the trucker in booth 3 kept checking his watch, probably worried about his delivery schedule, the elderly couple by the window sharing a slice of pie, their hands clasped together on the table, the young man at the counter nursing his coffee, his military bearing evident in his posture. Elena approached, her order pad tucked into her apron pocket. "Just got word from Jimmy on the radio," she said quietly, referring to the friendly truck stop operator down the highway. "Says there's been some trouble heading this way. Bikers causing problems at other stops." Rachel nodded, taking in the information while maintaining her calm demeanor. It wasn't the first time they'd heard such warnings. Highway 87 had its share of troublemakers, but Morrison's Highway Haven had always been a neutral ground, a place where the unwritten rules of road courtesy usually prevented any serious problems. "Keep an eye on the door," Rachel instructed, her voice low but firm. "If anyone comes in looking for trouble, we handle it like we discussed." Elena nodded, understanding the protocol they'd established. Both women had seen enough conflict to know that prevention was always better than confrontation, but they were also more than capable of handling themselves if things went sideways. The cafe's screen door creaked open as Sheriff Kate Williams stepped in, bringing with her a blast of warm desert air. She removed her wide-brimmed hat, nodding to Rachel as she took her usual seat at the counter. The sheriff's presence was both welcome and concerning. She didn't usually stop by this late unless something was brewing. "Evening, Rachel," Kate said, accepting the coffee cup that Elena immediately placed before her. "Quiet night?" "So far," Rachel replied, noting the subtle tension in the sheriff's shoulders. "But something tells me you're not just here for the coffee." Kate took a slow sip, her eyes meeting Rachel's. "Got reports of the steel wolves moving through the county. They've already caused trouble at 2 stops north of here. Thought you should know." Rachel's expression remained neutral, but her mind was already running through scenarios, assessment, and planning happening automatically, just as it had during her years of service. The Steel Wolves had a reputation that preceded them, not just ordinary troublemakers, but a gang known for violence and intimidation. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the cafe's neon-signed paint patterns across the parking lot. Another truck rumbled into the lot, its air brakes hissing as it settled into a space. But Rachel's attention was drawn to a different sound, one that raised the hair on the back of her neck, the distant but growing rumble of multiple motorcycles approaching from the north. The distant rumble grew louder, transforming from a low growl into a thunderous roar that made the coffee cups vibrate on their saucers. Through the cafe's windows, Rachel Morrison could see the approaching headlights. Not just 1 or 2, but a whole pack of motorcycles cutting through the desert darkness like angry fireflies. The Steel Wolves had arrived. Sheriff Kate Williams set down her coffee cup, her hand instinctively moving toward her holster. "Rachel, I can call for backup." "Not yet," Rachel replied calmly, though her mind was already assessing angles, distances, potential threats. "Let's see what they want first." The motorcycles pulled into the parking lot in a practiced formation, their engines drowning out all other sounds. Leading the pack was a massive Harley-Davidson, its chromework gleaming under the neon lights. The rider, an imposing figure known as Shadow Davidson, cut his engine first, the others following suit until only the tick of cooling metal remained. Elena moved smoothly between tables, quietly urging customers toward the back of the cafe. The young family by the window hurriedly paid their bill and slipped out the side door, while the truckers in the corner booth sat up straighter, their conversations dying mid-sentence. A retired couple who had been enjoying their evening coffee clutched each other's hands tightly, their knuckles white with tension. The Steel Wolves dismounted their bikes with practiced synchronization. Shadow stood well over 6 feet tall, his leather vest adorned with patches that told stories of violence and territory claimed. Behind him, Cole Switchblade Parker, his second in command, cracked his knuckles with deliberate menace. The rest of the gang spread out in a loose semicircle, 8 riders in total, each carrying an aura of barely contained aggression. Among them, Rachel noticed a younger member, Marcus Riley, who moved with less certainty than the others. His vest was newer, the leather not yet creased with age and violence. His eyes darted between Shadow and the cafe windows, a flicker of unease crossing his features. He seemed out of place among the hardened criminals, like a boy trying to play at being a man. The bell above the door chimed as Shadow pushed it open, the screen door banging against the wall with unnecessary force. He had to duck slightly to enter, his boots leaving dusty prints on the freshly mopped floor. The rest of the gang filed in behind him, filling the small cafe with the smell of leather, gasoline, and desert heat. Their heavy footsteps echoed against the linoleum, a rhythmic sound that seemed to drum up the tension in the room. Rachel stood behind the counter, her posture relaxed but alert, years of military training evident in her stance. Elena positioned herself near the kitchen door, while Sheriff Williams remained seated at the counter, deliberately casual, but strategically placed to view the entire room. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the bikers' faces, making them look even more menacing. "Welcome to Morrison's Highway Haven," Rachel said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of commanding Marines in combat zones. "Coffee's fresh, but kitchen's closing soon." Her hands remained steady as she wiped down the counter, a simple action that nonetheless showed she wouldn't be easily intimidated. Shadow's lips curled into what might have been a smile, but held no warmth. "Heard about this place," he drawled, looking around with exaggerated interest. "Heard it was veteran-friendly." His eyes landed on the Marine Corps flag, then moved to Rachel. "That yours?" "It is," Rachel confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. The flag behind her rippled slightly in the breeze from the air conditioning, its colors bold against the cafe's pale walls. Switchblade Parker moved to the counter, deliberately bumping against Sheriff Williams's chair. "Ain't that sweet," he sneered. a lady Marine running a little cafe. Bet you serve real good pie. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His leather gloves creaked as he flexed his fingers, a subtle but clear threat. Kate Williams didn't move, but her voice carried a warning. Watch yourself, Parker. Her badge caught the light as she shifted slightly, a reminder of law and order in an increasingly tense situation. Shadow raised a hand, silencing his lieutenant. Now, we're just here for some hospitality. Ain't that right, boys? The gang members spread out, some taking seats at empty booths, others remaining standing, effectively boxing in the remaining customers. Their boots scuffed against the floor, leaving marks on Rachel's meticulously maintained tiles. You're welcome to order, Rachel said firmly, but any trouble, and this conversation ends quickly. Her voice remained steady, carrying the same tone she'd used to command platoons in combat zones far more dangerous than this cafe. Shadow's expression hardened. That almost sounds like a threat, Marine. The fluorescent lights cast deep shadows under his eyes, making his face look skull-like and threatening. Just stating facts, Rachel replied. We run a peaceful establishment here. Behind her, the coffee maker hissed and gurgled, an oddly normal sound in the tension-filled room. Marcus Riley, the younger biker, shifted uncomfortably near the door. His hand brushed against a display of local papers, sending them scattering across the floor. The sound made several customers jump, and tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. He mumbled an apology, earning a sharp glare from Switchblade. Peaceful, Shadow repeated, as if tasting the word. You know what I heard? I heard this place has been turning away some of our associates, making them feel unwelcome. That ain't peaceful. That ain't hospitable. Rachel's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the coffee pot she was holding, her combat-trained mind already mapping out potential scenarios. The evening air in the cafe had grown thick with tension, the usual comfort of the place eroding under the steel wolves' menacing presence. The jukebox in the corner, sensing the mood perhaps, had fallen silent between songs, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft clink of coffee cups against saucers. Your associates, Rachel replied evenly, setting down the coffee pot with deliberate care. We're harassing my customers and threatening my staff. That kind of behavior isn't welcome here, no matter who you ride with. The pot made a soft sound as it settled on the warming plate, the coffee inside still bubbling gently. Switchblade Parker's face darkened as he leaned across the counter, his leather vest creaking. Maybe you need a lesson in hospitality, he snarled, his breath reeking of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. See, out here on Highway 87, businesses like yours survive by being friendly to the right people. His calloused fingers drummed against the countertop, leaving smudges on the freshly wiped surface. Elena Torres moved silently behind Rachel, her Army medic training evident in her calculated movements. She positioned herself where she could reach the panic button under the counter while maintaining a clear view of both exits. The remaining customers had retreated to the far corner of the cafe, huddling together like sheep sensing wolves. A young waitress, barely 18, pressed herself against the wall near the kitchen, her order pad clutched to her chest like a shield. Shadow Davidson watched the scene unfold with calculated interest, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the checkerboard floor. Switchblade, he said, his voice carrying a note of warning. Let's not be hasty. The lady deserves a chance to reconsider her position. His eyes never left Rachel's face as he spoke, studying her with the kind of intensity that had intimidated countless others before her. The young prospect, Marcus Riley, had retreated to a corner booth, his discomfort growing more visible by the minute. He fiddled nervously with a sugar packet, tearing it open and watching the white granules spill across the table like sand in an hourglass. The other steel wolves had spread throughout the cafe, their presence like dark stains on the usually cheerful atmosphere. Their leather vests creaked as they moved, patches displaying their allegiance glinting under the fluorescent lights. Sheriff Kate Williams remained at her spot at the counter, her coffee now forgotten and growing cold. Her right hand rested casually near her hip, close to her service weapon, while her left hand had slipped beneath the counter where Rachel knew she was sending a text message to dispatch. The sheriff's face remained neutral, but her eyes tracked every movement of the bikers with professional attention, years of law enforcement experience evident in her steady gaze. "Let me be clear," Rachel said, her voice carrying the same authority she'd used to command Marines in combat zones. "This cafe serves everyone who respects our rules. Veterans, civilians, truckers, bikers, everyone. But the moment someone threatens the safety of this place or its people, they're done. No exceptions." Her words hung in the air, carried by the same tone that had once directed troops through firefights and ambushes. A low murmur rippled through the steel wolves. Some shifted uncomfortably, their boots scuffing against the linoleum floor, while others exchanged dark looks. Shadow's expression remained unreadable as he took a step closer to the counter, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. The overhead lights cast deep shadows across his face, making his scars more pronounced. "Strong words," he said softly, dangerously. "But words don't mean much out here in the desert. Actions speak louder, don't they, boys?" The gang members nodded in agreement, some cracking their knuckles menacingly. The sound echoed off the cafe's walls like distant gunfire. Elena had begun moving customers toward the kitchen's back exit, her movement subtle but purposeful. Old Pete, the Tuesday regular, refused to budge from his spot at the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup like it was an anchor in a storm. His jaw was set in determination, a reminder that not all courage wore a uniform. "You're right," Rachel agreed, surprising Shadow with her response. "Actions do speak louder." She reached beneath the counter and produced a worn leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a set of medals and citations from her Marine Corps days. The medal decorations caught the light, their significance unmistakable. 3 tours in combat zones: Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. Those are actions that speak pretty loud. The air in the cafe seemed to crackle with electricity as Shadow studied the medals, his face revealing nothing. Outside, a desert wind had picked up, making the neon sign buzz and flicker, casting alternating shadows across the parking lot, where the motorcycles stood like silent sentinels. "Fancy jewelry don't mean nothing here," Switchblade sneered, reaching for the wallet. "Let's see how tough you really—" Before he could finish his sentence, Rachel's hand shot out, catching his wrist in a grip that made him gasp. Her movement was fluid, precise, and incredibly fast, the kind of speed that only comes from years of combat training. The sudden action made several coffee cups rattle on their saucers, the sound sharp in the tense silence. The atmosphere in Morrison's highway haven crystallized into something dangerous as Rachel maintained her iron grip on Switchblade's wrist. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat stretching like molasses in the desert heat. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces both hostile and afraid. Shadow Davidson's lips curled into something between a snarl and a smile. "Let him go," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. His massive frame shifted slightly, leather creaking as he moved closer to the counter, each step deliberate and measured like a predator stalking its prey. "I will," Rachel replied calmly, "when he learns to keep his hands to himself." With a subtle twist, she adjusted her grip, making Switchblade inhale sharply. Her years of combat training had taught her exactly how much pressure to apply, enough to control, not enough to break. Not yet. The muscles in her forearm rippled slightly, a reminder of countless hours spent perfecting these techniques in far more dangerous situations. Elena Torres had positioned herself strategically near the kitchen entrance, her Army medic training evident in how she assessed the situation. She knew that in confined spaces like this, medical emergencies could escalate quickly. The baseball bat behind the counter was within easy reach, but she hoped it wouldn't come to that. Her eyes constantly scanned the room, noting possible escape routes and potential weapons if things went south. The young prospect, Marcus Riley, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. His right hand unconsciously touched the newly sewn patch on his vest, the leather still stiff and unmarked by violence. This wasn't what he'd imagined when he'd joined the Steel Wolves. He'd wanted brotherhood, not this kind of brutal intimidation. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Switchblade's face had turned an interesting shade of red, a vein pulsing in his forehead as he struggled against Rachel's grip. "You're dead," he spat, trying to mask his pain with bravado. "You hear me?" "When we're done with this place," his free hand clenched and unclenched, the leather of his fingerless gloves creaking with each movement. Rachel increased the pressure ever so slightly, cutting off his threat mid-sentence. "In the cores," she said conversationally as if discussing the weather, "they taught us that the wrist has 8 small bones. Each one can be manipulated in very specific ways. Would you like a demonstration?" The fluorescent lights caught the silver threads in her hair, earned through years of service rather than age. Sheriff Kate Williams stood slowly from her counter seat, her movement deliberate and controlled. "Think carefully about your next move," she advised the bikers. "Backup's already on the way. This doesn't have to get uglier." Her badge caught the light as she shifted, a reminder of law and order in an increasingly lawless situation. The other Steel Wolves had begun to spread out, creating a loose circle around the counter. Their boots scuffed against the linoleum floor, leaving dark marks on the freshly mopped surface. The remaining customers pressed themselves against the far wall, except for old Pete, who continued to sip his coffee with remarkable composure, his weathered hands steady around the porcelain cup. Shadow's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. The Marine's grip on his lieutenant, the sheriff's steady hand near her weapon, the army medic's strategic position. These women weren't the easy targets he'd anticipated. The air conditioning hummed softly, pushing the scent of coffee and tension through the room, mixing with the leather and sweat of the increasingly agitated bikers. "Maybe," Shadow said slowly, "we got off on the wrong foot here." He raised his hands in a gesture that might have been peaceful, if not for the brass knuckles glinting on his right hand. "Why don't we discuss this like reasonable people?" His voice carried the false smoothness of a rattlesnake's warning. "Reasonable would have been respecting my first warning," Rachel replied. She released Switchblade's wrist with a subtle push that sent him stumbling backward into one of his companions, boots squeaking against the floor. "But I'm willing to start fresh, if you are." Her stance remained relaxed but ready, weight perfectly balanced for whatever might come next. Switchblade rubbed his wrist, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. A thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead, though whether from pain or anger was hard to tell. "You can't," he began, but Shadow cut him off with a sharp gesture that echoed through the tense silence. "The lady made an offer," Shadow rumbled. "Show some respect." The words carried a double meaning that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. He turned back to Rachel, his expression unreadable beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "But respect goes both ways. We have a reputation to maintain." "So do I," Rachel countered. The medals on the counter gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a testament to battles fought and won on foreign soil. "Mine was earned in combat. How'd you earn yours?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke after a firefight, heavy with challenge and unspoken threats. Several of the Steel Wolves shifted uncomfortably, the sound of creaking leather filling the tense silence. Outside, the neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting alternating shadows through the cafe's large windows. A semi-truck rumbled past on Highway 87, its headlights briefly illuminating the row of motorcycles parked outside like silent sentinels. Marcus Riley had edged closer to the door, his young face a mask of uncertainty. The Steel Wolves patch on his vest seemed to weigh heavier with each passing moment. He watched Shadow carefully, wondering if this was the moment everything would explode into violence. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of a nearby chair, knuckles white with tension. Elena's fingers brushed against the handle of the baseball bat behind the counter, her medical training telling her exactly where to strike if it came to that. She'd seen enough combat injuries to know precisely how much force it would take to incapacitate without killing. The desert wind outside had picked up, making the cafe's sign creak on its hinges, a lonely sound in the gathering darkness. In the kitchen, the young waitress who'd been trying to make herself invisible pressed against the industrial refrigerator, its steady hum offering little comfort. Through the service window, she could see the entire scene unfolding, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The coffee in the pot had begun to burn, adding a bitter note to the tension-filled air. The tension in Morrison's highway haven coiled tighter as Shadow Davidson straightened to his full height, towering over the counter like a thundercloud. The fluorescent lights cast deep shadows across his scarred face, making the tattoos on his neck seem to writhe with each movement. Outside, the desert wind had picked up, sending a tumbleweed skittering across the parking lot between the gleaming motorcycles. Combat? Shadow's voice carried a mix of amusement and something darker. That's cute. We've got our own kind of combat out here on the roads. Ain't that right, boys? A murmur of agreement rippled through the steel wolves, punctuated by the sound of cracking knuckles and shuffling boots against the linoleum floor. Rachel maintained her position behind the counter, her stance casual but perfectly balanced. Years of military training had taught her to read body language like a book, and right now every page spelled trouble. She noticed how Switchblade's right hand kept twitching toward his vest pocket, how 3 of the bikers had subtly positioned themselves near the exits. The overhead lights flickered briefly, casting momentary shadows that made the scene even more ominous. Elena Torres moved silently along the counter, ostensibly wiping down surfaces but actually positioning herself for better coverage of the room. Her medical kit, always within reach under the counter, might be needed before the night was over. The familiar weight of the baseball bat pressed against her leg, a reassuring presence. Her years of Army medical training had taught her that prevention was better than treatment, but she was prepared for either. Here's the thing, Shadow continued, running a finger along the counter's edge, leaving a trail in the light dust. We've got a certain way of doing things. Businesses along this stretch of highway understand that. They show appreciation for our protection. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Your cafe seems to be the only one that doesn't get it. His massive frame cast a shadow over the counter's surface, making the coffee cups seem small and fragile in comparison. Sheriff Kate Williams shifted her weight slightly, her badge catching the light. Sounds an awful lot like extortion, Davidson. That's still illegal in Arizona. Her hand remained near her weapon, her eyes tracking the movements of the bikers with professional attention. 20 years of law enforcement experience had taught her how quickly situations like this could escalate. Switchblade sneered, still nursing his injured wrist. Law's a funny thing out here, ain't it? Sometimes it takes its sweet time showing up when needed. His eyes flickered to the sheriff's badge with obvious contempt. Lots can happen while waiting for backup. The threat in his voice was as clear as the desert sky outside. The young prospect, Marcus Riley, had pressed himself against the wall near the entrance, his face a mask of growing unease. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he joined the Steel Wolves. He'd wanted brotherhood, adventure, the open road, not this systematic intimidation of people just trying to make an honest living. His new leather vest felt heavy on his shoulders, the patch seeming to burn against his back. Through the large windows, the neon sign's glow painted everything in alternating shades of blue and red, creating an almost surreal atmosphere inside the cafe. A semi-truck rumbled past on the highway, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene through the windows, before disappearing into the desert night, leaving the tension even thicker in its wake. Rachel's voice cut through the tension like a combat knife. "Let me be clear about something," she said, her tone carrying the same authority that had once commanded Marines through firefights. "This cafe serves everyone, truckers, travelers, bikers, everyone. But it serves them food and coffee, not fear. You want to be customers? Fine. You want to be thugs?" Her eyes locked with Shadow's. "That's a different story." The coffee maker behind her hissed and gurgled, an oddly domestic sound in the charged atmosphere. A low growl rumbled through the steel wolves. One of them, a heavily tattooed man near the jukebox, spat on the floor. "Tough talk from someone outnumbered," he snarled. "Maybe we should show her how we handle disrespect." His boots left dark marks on the freshly mopped floor as he took a step forward. Old Pete, still seated at the counter, set down his coffee cup with a deliberate clink. The elderly veteran's voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the tense air. "Son, if you're counting numbers, you might want to count again." His weathered hand gestured to his own veteran's cap, then to the Marine Corps flag, then to Elena's Army medic badge pinned to her apron. The fluorescent lights caught the silver in his hair, earned through years of service and sacrifice. Shadow's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room again, taking in details he'd missed before. The way Rachel stood, balanced and ready. Elena's calculated movements. The sheriff's professional calm. Even old Pete's steady gaze. The air conditioning hummed softly, pushing the scent of coffee and tension through the room, mixing with the leather and sweat of the increasingly agitated bikers. "Last chance," Shadow said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You either play nice with the Steel Wolves or this place." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but clear. The ceiling fan above spun lazily, its shadows dancing across the floor like specters waiting to see what would happen next. Rachel's response was interrupted by the distant sound of thunder. Or perhaps it was motorcycles approaching from the highway. Shadow's head turned slightly toward the sound, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. In that moment, Rachel knew the next few minutes would determine everything. The distant rumble grew louder, a mechanical thunder that made the cafe's windows vibrate slightly in their frames. Shadow Davidson's expression darkened as he recognized the sound. Not ordinary motorcycles, but the distinctive growl of Desert Eagles, the veteran motorcycle club that patrolled this stretch of highway. Their reputation for protecting local businesses was well known, especially among troublemakers like the Steel Wolves. "Expecting company?" Shadow's voice carried a dangerous edge as he turned back to Rachel. His massive frame tensed like a predator sensing a larger threat approaching. The other Steel Wolves exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado wavering slightly. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, highlighting the uncertainty that had begun to creep in. "I don't expect anything," Rachel replied calmly, though her mind was already calculating new scenarios. "But word travels fast out here in the desert, especially when it comes to people causing trouble." The metals on the counter caught the fluorescent light, a reminder of battles fought and won. Her fingers rested lightly on the counter's edge, ready to move at a moment's notice. Elena Torres moved with practiced efficiency, repositioning herself to cover both the main entrance and the approaching sounds. Her Army medic training had taught her that situations like this often ended with people needing medical attention, or worse. The baseball bat remained within easy reach as she wiped down the counter with deliberate movements, her eyes never staying in one place too long. Marcus Riley, the young prospect, had edged even closer to the door, his face a mixture of fear and relief. The Steel Wolves patch on his vest seemed to weigh heavier with each passing moment. Through the windows, he could see the first hints of headlights approaching, their beams cutting through the desert darkness like searching eyes. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Switchblade Parker's face contorted with rage as he stepped toward Rachel again, his boots leaving scuff marks on the freshly mopped floor. "You think calling in some washed-up vets is going to scare us?" His injured wrist was forgotten in his anger. "We're the Steel Wolves. We don't back down from anyone." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying his growing nervousness. Sheriff Kate Williams stood smoothly, her movement drawing all eyes. "Then today might be a good day to learn," she said, her voice carrying the weight of law and authority. Her badge gleamed under the harsh lights as she adjusted her stance, ready for whatever came next. 20 years of law enforcement experience had taught her that pride often preceded violence. The rumble outside had become a roar, and now multiple headlights illuminated the parking lot through the large windows, casting long shadows across the cafe's interior. The Desert Eagles had arrived. At least 15 bikes, their riders all veterans from various branches of service. Their chromework gleamed under the cafe's neon sign as they pulled in with military precision, effectively surrounding the Steel Wolves motorcycles. Old Pete smiled into his coffee cup, a knowing look in his weathered eyes. His weathered hands, marked by years of service, wrapped around the warm porcelain. "Ain't it something," he mused aloud, "how folks look out for each other out here in the desert?" His voice carried clearly despite the noise outside, years of command experience evident in his tone. Shadow's jaw clenched as he watched the Desert Eagles through the windows, the muscle in his cheek twitching visibly. Their leader, a former Force Recon Marine named Jack Iron Thompson, was already dismounting his bike. The other riders followed suit, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Each wore their service branch insignia proudly alongside their club patches, medals and ribbons that had been earned rather than claimed. "This doesn't concern them," Shadow growled, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. His hands clenched into fists, the brass knuckles catching the light. "This is between us and the cafe." The overhead fan continued its lazy rotation, stirring the tension-filled air. Rachel's voice remained steady as she replied, "No, it's between you and the whole community. Did you really think you could threaten people here without consequences?" The coffee maker behind her finished its cycle with a final hiss, punctuating her words. Steam rose from the fresh pot, curling in the air like ghost stories waiting to be told. Elena had begun quietly ushering the remaining customers toward the kitchen's back exit, her movements calm but urgent. The young waitress who'd been trembling by the kitchen door finally found her courage, helping an elderly couple gather their belongings. The sound of boots on gravel outside grew louder as the Desert Eagles positioned themselves around the building, a perimeter of veterans who understood the true meaning of brotherhood. The bell above the door chimed as Jack Thompson entered, followed by 2 other Desert Eagles. His combat experience was evident in how he immediately assessed the situation, noting positions, threats, and potential weapons. His eyes met Rachel's briefly, a silent acknowledgement between warriors. The desert wind followed him in, carrying the scent of sage and approaching rain. "Evening, folks," Jack said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that needed no volume to command attention. "Heard there might be some trouble out here." His gaze swept over the Steel Wolves, lingering on Shadow. "Thought we'd stop by and make sure everything's friendly." His hand rested casually on his belt, near where Rachel knew he carried a combat knife, not a threat, but a reminder. The tension in the room had shifted, the balance of power tipping noticeably. Several of the Steel Wolves had begun to back away from the counter, their earlier aggression replaced by calculating caution. The desert wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the sound of more motorcycles in the distance. Thunder rolled across the desert sky, nature's own warning of the storm to come. Shadow Davidson's massive frame tensed like a coiled spring as he assessed the new situation. The once intimidating presence of the Steel Wolves had diminished considerably with the arrival of the Desert Eagles, whose military discipline was evident in their precise positioning both inside and outside Morrison's highway haven. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting stark shadows across faces both hostile and resolute. "Well, well," Shadow drawled, though his usual confidence had gained a brittle edge. "The cavalry arrives. Didn't know we needed a war council for a simple business discussion." His fingers flexed unconsciously, the brass knuckles catching the light with each movement. The leather of his vest creaked as he shifted his weight, a sound almost lost beneath the growing storm outside. Jack Thompson stepped forward, his combat boots silent on the linoleum floor, a veteran's instinct for moving without sound. Business discussion? His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had commanded men in far worse situations. Funny. From outside, it looked more like intimidation. The Desert Eagles behind him maintained their positions, their presence transforming the homey café into something resembling a tactical operation. Behind the counter, Rachel Morrison maintained her ready stance, years of Marine Corps training evident in her controlled stillness. The medals on the counter gleamed under the harsh lighting, each one a testament to battles fought and won in far-off lands. Elena Torres had positioned herself near the kitchen entrance, her medical kit within easy reach, though her expression suggested she hoped it wouldn't be needed. Her fingers traced the edge of the baseball bat, ready, but not eager. Switchblade Parker, his injured wrist still held close to his chest, couldn't contain his rage any longer. A vein pulsed in his forehead as he stepped forward. "You think you can just ride in here and—" His words cut off as Shadow's massive hand clamped down on his shoulder, squeezing hard enough to make him wince. The overhead fan cast rotating shadows across his face, making his expression shift between anger and fear with each pass. "Easy," Shadow warned, his eyes never leaving Jack Thompson. The cafe had become a powder keg, and everyone could feel it. The ceiling fan continued its lazy rotation, stirring the tension-thick air. Through the windows, lightning flickered across the desert sky, briefly illuminating the rows of motorcycles outside like chrome sentinels in the gathering darkness. The young prospect, Marcus Riley, had pressed himself against the wall near the entrance, his eyes darting between Shadow and the Desert Eagles. The steel wolves patch on his vest seemed to burn against his skin now, a brand of shame rather than pride. Sweat trickled down his back, despite the air conditioning's steady hum. Through the windows, he could see more Desert Eagles taking up positions around the building, their military training evident in their tactical spacing. Sheriff Kate Williams spoke up from her position near the counter, her badge catching the light as she moved. Her voice carried the full weight of law enforcement authority. "Here's how this ends, Davidson. You and your boys walk out of here, get on your bikes, and ride away. No one needs to spend the night in county." Her hand remained near her service weapon, a silent reminder of official consequences. Years of dealing with troublemakers had taught her that sometimes the threat of jail was more effective than the threat of violence. Old Pete set his coffee cup down with a deliberate clink, the sound sharp in the tense silence. Steam rose from the dark liquid, curling in the air like questions waiting to be answered. "Might want to listen to the lady, son. Some fights ain't worth picking." His weathered face held the wisdom of someone who had seen enough violence to know when to avoid it. The fluorescent lights caught the silver in his hair, earned through years of service rather than age. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert sky, a natural accompaniment to the human storm brewing inside the cafe. The neon sign flickered, casting alternating shadows through the windows, painting the scene in surreal shades of red and blue. Rain had begun to fall in earnest now, drumming against the roof and windows like distant gunfire. Jack Thompson moved with casual precision, positioning himself between Shadow and Rachel. His desert-worn boots made no sound on the linoleum floor, a skill learned in combat zones where silence meant survival. "You've got a choice here," he said quietly. "Walk away with your pride somewhat intact, or push this and find out exactly what combat veterans do when protecting their own." His words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with the weight of experience. The other Desert Eagles in the cafe had spread out strategically, their movements synchronized by years of military training. Each one carried themselves with the quiet confidence of those who had faced real combat, not just barroom brawls. Their patches told stories of service, Marines, Army, Air Force, Navy, all united now in defense of this small desert sanctuary. Rachel noticed Shadow's eyes darting between exits, calculating odds, measuring distances. She recognized the look, a predator realizing it had wandered into the wrong territory. The coffee maker gurgled in the background, an oddly domestic sound in the charged atmosphere. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with leather and rain, creating an incongruous blend of comfort and tension. "This isn't over," Shadow growled, but the threat in his voice had hollowed out. The Steel Wolf's earlier bravado had evaporated like morning dew in the desert sun. Even Switchblade seemed to have lost his appetite for confrontation, nursing both his injured wrist and his wounded pride. The storm outside intensified, thunder cracking like nature's own warning shot. The desert wind rattled the cafe's windows, carrying with it the first hints of real rain. The storm that had been threatening all evening was finally breaking, nature's own countdown to whatever would happen next. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and tension, waiting for someone to make the next move. A clap of thunder shook Morrison's highway haven, rattling the windows and causing the lights to flicker momentarily. In that brief second of semi-darkness, the tension in the cafe crystallized into something sharp and dangerous. Shadow Davidson's massive frame seemed to fill the space between the counter and the door, his leather vest creaking as he weighed his rapidly diminishing options. The storm outside had intensified, sheets of rain now hammering against the windows like nature's own percussion. Brotherhood, he spat the word like it tasted bitter, his scarred face twisted in contempt. You vets think you're the only ones who understand it. Out here on the road, we've got our own code. His hands clenched and unclenched, brass knuckles catching the fluorescent light with each movement. Behind him, the remaining steel wolves had begun to shift uneasily, their earlier confidence crumbling in the face of overwhelming opposition. Their boots scuffed against the linoleum floor, leaving dark marks on its freshly mopped surface. Jack Thompson's response was measured, his voice carrying the weight of experience earned in combat rather than bar fights. Brotherhood isn't about intimidation, Davidson. It's about standing together for something bigger than yourself. His eyes swept the cafe, taking in the Desert Eagles positioned strategically throughout the space. These people here, they're under our protection. The overhead fan cast rotating shadows across his face, highlighting the scars earned in far-off battlefields. Rachel Morrison watched the exchange from behind the counter, her military training allowing her to spot the subtle signs of impending violence. The way Switchblade Parker's weight had shifted to his back foot, how 3 of the steel wolves had spread out in a classic flanking position. The baseball bat pressed against her leg was a reassuring presence, though she hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Years of combat experience had taught her that the moment before violence erupted was always the most crucial. Elena Torres moved with practiced efficiency, continuing to guide the remaining customers toward safety. The elderly couple who had been sharing pie now huddled near the kitchen exit, their faces pale but determined. The young waitress had found her courage, helping to shield them while maintaining a clear path to the back door. The kitchen's fluorescent lights cast long shadows through the service window, creating an almost theatrical backdrop to the unfolding drama. The desert wind howled outside, carrying sheets of rain that drummed against the roof and windows. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the parking lot where more Desert Eagles had taken up positions around the Steel Wolves' motorcycles. The chrome gleamed wetly in the storm, reflecting the cafe's neon sign like pools of liquid fire. Each flash of lightning revealed more veterans arriving, their bikes pulling in with military precision. Marcus Riley, the young prospect, had begun to edge away from his fellow Steel Wolves. His new vest felt like it was made of lead, the patches and pins weighing him down with each passing moment. The disgust and uncertainty on his face were plain to see as he watched his supposed brothers reveal their true nature. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cool air conditioning, and his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the back of a nearby chair. "Last chance," Sheriff Kate Williams announced, her voice cutting through the tension. "Walk away now, and we can all pretend this was just a social call gone wrong. Stay, and you'll be explaining to a judge why you thought threatening a veteran-owned business was a good idea." Her badge caught the light as she shifted, a reminder of law and order in an increasingly volatile situation. 20 years of law enforcement experience had taught her to recognize the crucial moment when situations either de-escalated or exploded. Old Pete remained at his spot at the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Years of combat experience had taught him to read a room, and right now, every instinct told him the Steel Wolves were about to make a crucial mistake. The coffee maker behind the counter continued its steady drip, marking time like a countdown. Steam rose from his cup, curling in the air like question marks. Through the windows, more Desert Eagles could be seen arriving, their headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. The parking lot had become a sea of chrome and leather, veterans from every branch of service united in common purpose. The storm's intensity matched the atmosphere inside, thunder rolling across the desert sky like nature's own warning, Shadow's face contorted with rage and wounded pride. the fluorescent lights casting deep shadows in his scowl lines. "You think this is over?" he snarled, taking a step toward Jack Thompson. "You think you can just ride in here and—" His words were cut short by another thunderclap, this one close enough to make the building shudder and the lights flicker ominously. In that moment, Switchblade made his move. His good hand darted inside his vest, reaching for what everyone assumed was a concealed weapon. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Desert Eagles moved as one, their training evident in their coordinated response. Jack Thompson's hand shot out, catching Switchblade's wrist in an iron grip before he could complete his movement. The sudden action sent a coffee cup crashing to the floor, its shatter lost in another roll of thunder. "Don't!" Jack's voice was quiet but carried easily through the suddenly still air. "You really don't want to escalate this." The rain continued its assault on the windows, providing a dramatic backdrop to the scene unfolding inside. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cafe in stark white light that made everyone's faces look mask-like and ghostly. Rachel had vaulted over the counter with Marine Corps' efficiency, positioning herself to better control the situation. Elena had also moved, her medical kit ready, but her stance suggesting she was prepared to create patients rather than just treat them. The remaining Steel Wolves found themselves surrounded by combat veterans whose quiet competence spoke of battles fought and won in far deadlier environments than a desert cafe. The tableau held for a heartbeat. Switchblade's hand still trapped in Jack Thompson's iron grip, Shadow Davidson's massive frame coiled like a spring about to release, and Rachel Morrison positioned to strike if necessary. The storm outside provided a fitting soundtrack, thunder rolling across the desert like distant artillery fire. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting strange shadows that danced across the cafe's worn linoleum floor. Switchblade's concealed hand slowly emerged from his vest, revealing not a weapon, but a cell phone. "Just calling for backup," he sneered, though his voice trembled slightly. The phone clattered to the floor as Jack released his wrist with a slight shove, sending him stumbling backward into a booth. The sound echoed through the tense cafe, mixing with the steady drumming of rain against the windows. "Backup?" Jack's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Look outside, son. Your backup wouldn't make it past the parking lot." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the growing number of Desert Eagles who had surrounded the building. Their bikes gleamed in the rain, creating a chrome barrier between the cafe and the highway. Each flash revealed more veterans arriving, their military discipline evident in their precise positioning. Shadow's face darkened as he assessed their deteriorating situation, the harsh overhead lights deepening the lines of frustration etched across his features. The Steel Wolves' reputation for intimidation meant nothing against combat-hardened veterans who had faced far worse than leather-clad bullies. His eyes darted between exits, calculating odds that grew worse by the minute. The leather of his vest creaked as he shifted his weight, his brass knuckles catching the light with each subtle movement. Elena Torres had positioned herself near the kitchen door, her medical training giving her a unique perspective on the tension in the room. She could see the micro-expressions of fear beginning to crack through the Steel Wolves' tough facades, the slight tremor in Switchblade's good hand, the way two others kept glancing at the exits, the beads of sweat forming on their foreheads, despite the cool air conditioning. The young waitress behind her had stopped trembling, drawing strength from the calm competence of the veterans around her. Through the kitchen's service window, the remaining customers huddled together, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. The elderly couple who had been enjoying their evening coffee now held hands tightly, their wedding rings catching the light. A trucker who had refused to leave gripped his coffee cup like it was an anchor in a storm. "You're surrounded," Sheriff Williams stated matter-of-factly, her hand still resting near her weapon. Desert Eagles in front, state police approaching from both directions, on the highway. Whatever you're thinking, it's not worth it. The radio on her belt crackled with updates from incoming units, their sirens barely audible over the storm. Her badge reflected the overhead lights, a constant reminder of law and order in the increasingly tense situation. Marcus Riley, the young prospect, made his decision. With deliberate movements, he began removing his Steel Wolves vest. "I'm done," he announced, his voice steady despite the tension. This isn't what I signed up for. I wanted brotherhood, not bullying. The leather vest hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet cafe. The patches and pins that had seemed so important hours ago now looked cheap and meaningless under the harsh fluorescent lights. Shadow spun toward Marcus, rage contorting his features. His massive frame seemed to expand with fury, filling the space between tables. "You gutless!" His movement toward the young man was instantly checked as Rachel stepped between them, her stance casual, but ready. Behind her, 3 Desert Eagles had also moved forward, their positioning precise and practiced, creating an impenetrable wall of combat-trained veterans. "The kid's got more guts than you," Rachel said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that could only be earned through real combat experience. "He knows when to walk away from a bad situation." The medals on the counter caught the light again, a reminder of battles fought with both honor and purpose. The contrast between earned respect and demanded fear hung heavy in the air, as tangible as the storm-charged atmosphere. Old Pete set down his coffee cup with a deliberate clink that cut through the tension. "Reminds me of Fallujah," he mused aloud, his weathered voice carrying clearly. "Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit he's on the wrong side." His eyes met Marcus's, conveying understanding and respect. The young man straightened slightly under the veteran's approving gaze, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The coffee maker behind the counter finished its cycle with a final hiss, an oddly domestic sound in the charged atmosphere. Steam rose from the fresh pot, curling in the air like questions waiting to be answered. Outside, the storm intensified, wind driving rain against the windows in sheets. Lightning split the sky again, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that made the building shudder. Sheriff Williams's radio crackled again, this time with clear voices reporting their positions. State police units were now visible through the rain-streaked windows, their light bars painting the parking lot in alternating red and blue. The net was tightening, leaving the steel wolves with fewer options by the second. Their once intimidating presence had diminished considerably, like shadows retreating before the dawn. Sharp fluorescent light glinted off the raindrops streaming down Morrison's Highway Haven's windows as Shadow Davidson faced the inevitability of his situation. The Desert Eagles had formed an impenetrable line between him and the door, their military training evident in their positioning. The storm outside matched the tension within, lightning illuminating the scene in stark flashes of reality, each bolt casting harsh shadows across faces both determined and desperate. "Your colors," Jack Thompson said firmly, his voice carrying over the thunder. "Leave them here, all of you." His combat boots were planted solidly on the linoleum floor, his stance relaxed but ready, the kind of casual alertness that only comes from years of combat experience. Behind him, other Desert Eagles maintained their positions, creating a living barrier of combat experience and disciplined strength. Their own patches and insignias, earned in places like Fallujah, Kandahar, and Helmand, stood in stark contrast to the Steel Wolves' self-appointed badges of intimidation. Switchblade. Parker's face contorted with rage as he clutched his injured wrist, the skin around it already darkening with bruises. "You can't just—" His protest was cut short by a look from Shadow that could have frozen the desert itself. The cafe's air conditioning hummed steadily, pushing the scent of coffee and tension through the room, mixing with the metallic tang of approaching rain and the leather of too many jackets in too small a space. Rachel Morrison watched the scene unfold from her tactical position near the counter, noting how the remaining Steel Wolves had begun to shift uneasily. Their leather vests creaked with each movement, the sound almost lost beneath the drumming rain. The baseball bat at her side remained ready but untouched, a last resort she hoped wouldn't be necessary. Years of military service had taught her that sometimes the threat of violence was more effective than violence itself. Elena Torres had finished moving the last customers to safety through the kitchen's back exit, leaving only old Pete, who stubbornly remained at his counter seat, calmly sipping his coffee as if watching a particularly interesting TV show. The young waitress had found courage in the veteran's presence, now standing tall behind the counter instead of cowering. Her hands had stopped shaking as she wiped down the same spot repeatedly, finding comfort in the routine motion. The neon sign outside flickered rhythmically, its blue and red glow filtering through the rain-streaked windows to paint the scene in alternating colors. Each flash highlighted different aspects of the confrontation: the grim determination on Jack Thompson's face, the barely contained fury in Shadow's eyes, the quiet relief in Marcus Riley's posture as he stood apart from his former brothers. Shadow's massive frame seemed to deflate slightly like a balloon losing air. His eyes darted between the Desert Eagles, the approaching police lights visible through the windows, and his own increasingly nervous crew. The brass knuckles on his right hand caught the light one final time as he slowly unclenched his fist. Decades of cultivated intimidation crumbled in the face of real strength. "Fine," he growled, the word seeming to cost him physical pain. "But this isn't over." He began removing his steel wolf's vest with deliberate movements, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The patches and pins that had terrorized this stretch of highway for so long caught the light as he moved, their threatening symbols now seeming almost childish in the face of combat-earned authority. "Actually," Sheriff Kate Williams stepped forward, her badge gleaming under the harsh lighting. "It is over. You're done in this county, Davidson. We've got enough on you tonight for criminal threatening, attempted assault, and conspiracy to commit extortion. Want to add resisting arrest to that list?" Her hand remained casually near her weapon, years of law enforcement experience evident in her steady stance. The other steel wolves looked to their leader, uncertain. Through the windows, more police cruisers had arrived, their red and blue lights creating a spectacular light show in the rain, reflecting off the chrome of dozens of motorcycles. The storm continued its assault on the café, wind howling around the building's corners like a wild animal, rattling the windows in their frames. Marcus Riley, the former prospect, had moved to stand near the Desert Eagles, his discarded vest still lying on the floor where he'd dropped it. The patches that had seemed so important hours ago now looked cheap and tawdry under the harsh lighting. His face showed relief, as if he'd finally put down a heavy burden he'd been carrying too long. The young man's shoulders straightened as he stood among real warriors, finding strength in their quiet confidence. Thunder cracked overhead, making the building shudder. The coffee maker chose that moment to finish its cycle, its mundane gurgle a strange counterpoint to the tension. Steam rose from the fresh pot, curling in the air like question marks as old Pete's coffee cup clinked against its saucer as he set it down. Storm clouds continued to churn above Morrison's highway haven as the steel wolves filed out into the rain, their leather jackets now stripped of colors and meaning. Each man moved under the watchful eyes of the Desert Eagles, their exit marked by the splashing of boots through growing puddles and the steady drumbeat of rain against chrome. The cafe's neon sign painted the scene in alternating shades of red and blue, mixing with the emergency lights of the police cruisers that had formed a cordon around the parking lot. Shadow Davidson paused at the threshold, his massive frame silhouetted against the stormy night. The man who had terrorized this stretch of highway for so long now looked diminished somehow, like a mountain eroded by time and elements. His eyes met Rachel's one last time, carrying a mixture of grudging respect and smoldering resentment. Lightning flashed behind him, casting his shadow long across the cafe floor. "Remember what real strength looks like," Rachel said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the tension-filled air. "It's not about intimidation. It's about protection." The medals on the counter caught the light again, a testament to battles fought for something greater than oneself. Her fingers brushed against the bronze star unconsciously, memories of desert firefights and fallen comrades flickering through her mind. Elena Torres moved efficiently through the cafe, checking on the remaining customers who had emerged from their shelter in the kitchen. Her medical kit remained unopened, but her army training kept her alert for any signs of shock or distress. The elderly couple held each other tightly, their coffee long forgotten but their dignity intact. The young waitress had begun collecting scattered coffee cups with steady hands, the mundane task helping to restore normalcy to the disrupted evening. The storm's intensity began to match the mood inside, the rain drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm that seemed to wash away the tension of the night. Through the windows, the desert darkness was broken by occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the scene, like nature's own camera flashes capturing moments of transition and change. Sheriff Kate Williams coordinated with her deputies outside, her voice clear and professional as she directed the processing of complaints and statements. The radio on her belt crackled with updates from units positioned along the highway, tracking the Steel Wolves' departure from the county. Each report confirmed what everyone already knew. Their reign of terror was over. Her badge caught the light as she moved, a symbol of law and order restored. Marcus Riley stood near the Desert Eagles, his posture noticeably different from the uncertain prospect who had entered the cafe earlier. The weight of the Steel Wolves' colors no longer burdened his shoulders, replaced by something lighter: possibility. Jack Thompson placed a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder, the gesture carrying the weight of understanding. "There's always a choice," Jack said, his voice carrying the wisdom of countless battles. "You made the right one tonight." Old Pete finished his coffee with deliberate calm, setting the cup down with a soft clink that seemed to punctuate the evening's events. The porcelain made a gentle sound against the saucer, almost lost beneath the storm's continued assault. "Reminds me of a night in Kandahar," he mused, his eyes distant with memory. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing your ground. It's knowing when to walk away and find a better path." His weathered hands traced the rim of his cup, years of combat experience evident in their subtle tremors. The cafe's lights cast warm pools of illumination against the growing darkness outside, transforming the windows into mirrors that reflected the scene inside. The Desert Eagles maintained their vigilant positions, their military bearing evident in their steady stance and watchful eyes. Each veteran carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes not from intimidation, but from sacrifice and service. The air conditioning hummed steadily, pushing away the lingering scent of leather and tension, replacing it with the familiar comfort of coffee and apple pie. The overhead fans spun lazily, creating shifting shadows that danced across the walls like memories of the conflict that had just passed. In the kitchen, the rhythmic clinking of plates and cups provided a soundtrack of returning normalcy. Rachel's gaze swept across her cafe, noting the small signs of the evening's confrontation: scuff marks on the linoleum, scattered sugar packets, a toppled chair near the counter. But she also saw something else: the strength of community, the power of standing together against intimidation. The Desert Eagles had come when called, proving that some bonds run deeper than fear. Through the rain-streaked windows, they could see the Steel Wolves mounting their bikes, each machine roaring to life in a cascade of sound that competed with the rolling thunder. Shadow's massive Harley was the last to start, its engine's growl almost defiant in the face of defeat. The riders pulled out onto the highway one by one, their headlights cutting through the rain before disappearing into the desert night, leaving behind only the fading rumble of their engines. The young waitress approached Rachel with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands now steady and her eyes clear. The fear that had paralyzed her earlier had been replaced by a quiet strength. "Should I lock up?" she asked, her voice carrying a new confidence. The storm's lightning illuminated her face, showing a determination that hadn't been there before. "No," Rachel replied, pouring a fresh cup for old Pete. "Let's stay open a while longer. Tonight's a good night to remember what we stand for." The medals on her counter gleamed in agreement, each one earned in service of something greater than herself. The bronze star caught the light particularly well, its surface reflecting the cafe's warm glow. The remaining Desert Eagles began to relax their positions, though their vigilance never wavered completely. Years of combat experience had taught them that the aftermath of conflict could be just as dangerous as the confrontation itself. Their bikes gleamed in the rain, a chrome barrier of protection that would remain until they were certain the threat had truly passed. Jack Thompson moved to stand beside Rachel at the counter, his combat-worn boots silent on the linoleum floor. "You've built something special here," he said quietly, gesturing to the cafe and its gathered defenders. "More than just a place to get coffee, you've created a sanctuary." The respect in his voice was evident, one warrior recognizing another's chosen battlefield. The pile of surrendered Steel Wolves colors lay on a nearby table, a testament to the night's events. Elena picked them up with careful movements, folding each vest with military precision. "What should we do with these?" she asked, her hands running over the patches and pins that had once carried so much menace. "Keep them," old Pete suggested from his seat at the counter. "Put them up somewhere as a reminder, not of victory, but of choice, of the moment when people chose to walk away from darkness." His coffee cup was empty now, but he made no move to leave, understanding the importance of bearing witness to such moments. The storm's fury began to ease as if nature itself recognized that the night's drama had reached its conclusion. The thunder grew more distant, rolling across the desert like the retreating footsteps of a giant. Rain continued to fall, but gentler now, washing away the last traces of tension from the evening air. Sheriff Williams finished her call to dispatch, closing her notebook with a satisfied snap. "We'll have patrols watching the highways for the next few days," she announced, "but I don't think they'll be back. Some lessons stick." Her badge caught the light as she moved, a final reminder of the law's presence in this resolution. Marcus Riley remained with the Desert Eagles, finding acceptance among men and women who understood the true meaning of brotherhood. The weight of his decision to leave the Steel Wolves seemed lighter with each passing moment, replaced by the possibility of a different path, a better way to live the life he'd been seeking. The desert night settled into a peaceful rhythm as Morrison's highway haven began to return to normal. The storm had moved eastward, leaving behind the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth and the gentle patter of droplets falling from the cafe's awning. Inside, the tension of the earlier confrontation had been replaced by something warmer, a sense of community forged in adversity. Rachel Morrison moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, her military bearing still evident in her precise movements. The baseball bat had been returned to its place, but the medals remained on display, catching the light whenever someone passed by. Each gleam seemed to tell a story of service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of strength. The Desert Eagles had begun to relax, though they maintained a vigilant presence both inside and outside the cafe. Their bikes lined the parking lot in neat rows, chrome still wet from the rain and reflecting the neon sign's steady glow. Jack Thompson stood near the entrance, his weathered face thoughtful as he watched over the scene. "You know," he said to Rachel as she passed by with a fresh pot of coffee, "places like this are more important than most people realize. It's not just about food and coffee. It's about having somewhere to feel safe, somewhere to belong." His voice carried the weight of experience, of countless battles fought far from home. Elena Torres had finished tending to the few customers who'd stayed through the excitement, her medical kit now safely stowed away unused. She joined Rachel behind the counter, both women sharing a look that spoke volumes about their shared experiences in uniform. The young waitress worked alongside them, her movements more confident now, as if the night's events had awakened something stronger within her. Old Pete remained at his usual spot, though he'd finally allowed Rachel to refresh his coffee. "Reminds me of a place we had in Ramadi," he mused, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet cafe. Little coffee shop, run by a local family, became a sort of neutral ground where people could remember their humanity. His weathered hands wrapped around the warm cup as memories played across his face. Marcus Riley sat at the counter now, looking younger without the Steel Wolves vest, but somehow more mature in his bearing. The Desert Eagles had taken him under their wing, several veterans sharing stories of their own moments of choice, times when they'd had to decide who they really wanted to be. "The first step's the hardest," a Desert Eagle named Sarah told him, her Air Force wings catching the light. "But you'd be surprised how many paths open up once you start walking in the right direction." The others nodded in agreement, their own journeys reflected in their understanding eyes. Sheriff Kate Williams finished taking statements from the last few witnesses, her notepad filled with accounts of the night's events. "This will put a serious dent in their operations," she said, accepting a cup of coffee from Rachel. "But, more importantly, it shows what happens when a community stands together." Through the windows, the desert night stretched vast and dark, but it seemed less threatening now. The highway's distant rumble carried the sound of ordinary travelers, no longer shadowed by the threat of the steel wolves. The cafe's neon sign continued its steady glow, a beacon of safety in the darkness. Rachel walked to the window, gazing out at the scene she'd helped create. The medals on her chest caught her reflection in the glass, bronze star, purple heart, each one a reminder of fights fought for something greater than herself. But this victory felt different, more personal somehow. "You know," Elena said, joining her at the window, "when I got out of the army, I thought my days of making a difference were over. Funny how life proves you wrong." She smiled, the expression visible in their shared reflection. "We're still in the business of protection, just in a different way." The young waitress, Jenny, her name tag read, approached them with fresh coffee. "Will they really not come back?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been hours earlier, but still carrying a trace of concern. "No," Rachel said firmly. "They won't. Some lessons stick. And if they forget..." She glanced at the Desert Eagles, at Sheriff Williams, at the community that had come together to stand against intimidation. "Well, they'll get reminded." Old Pete chuckled from his seat. "Ain't that the truth?" he said, raising his cup in a small salute. "Some fights you win with bullets, some with badges, and some..." He gestured around the cafe. "Some you win with coffee and courage." The night continued to deepen, but Morrison's highway haven glowed with warmth and welcome. The neon sign buzzed softly, its light reaching out into the desert darkness like a promise. Here was safety, here was community, here was proof that sometimes the smallest stands could make the biggest differences. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.